Matthew Wilkie, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. You were appointed Principal Bassoonist of the Chamber Orchestra of Europe in 1986, and you've made a number of solo recordings and performances with them over the years. In 2000, you came back to Sydney in Australia, where you're now based, and are Principal Bassoonist of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. You regularly commute to Europe to play with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe. What would you say are your main challenges with being a principal bassoonist?
For me, I find it keeping up my level, because a lot of the pieces, I've played a number of times now. I actually like, when I'm looking at the schedule for the year, I often choose programs which are new for me, because I find that more interesting. But I don't know, I find when we're doing, for example, I've played Rite of Spring quite a lot in Sydney, and each time it's gone well, but then every time it comes up, I sort of think, I want to be able to do it the same, as well, at least as well as last time. So I guess that's that kind of pressure of keeping the level you've set yourself, and I'm usually my worst critic, so that's the pressure I put on myself, I suppose.
How about working with the other members of the woodwind section?
Well, I'm lucky that in both orchestras, in COE and also in the Sydney Symphony, I've got a great wind section. We get on very well together, very supportive. So, and also in Sydney, it's a very high standard. So we talk to each other. We're open to criticism from each other. So in that sense, it's a pleasurable place to work, and you feel most of the time that people are supporting you.
What would you say are your biggest stresses as a performer generally?
I find what's important in an orchestra for reducing the stress is making sure that you have colleagues and an atmosphere which is very supportive. So it makes a huge difference to how you feel, and that can give you a lot of confidence in your playing if you know that your colleagues are always behind you. Some orchestras, the way they audition, they choose the best player on the day, and I know some orchestras where the section of the orchestra didn't choose that person, but they still get into that orchestra. And that always, they might have been the best player, but that can lead to very difficult problems within sections. But as I said, I'm lucky in Sydney and in the Chamber of Europe. We get on very well together.
What is your experience personally of orchestral auditions?
When I came to Sydney, I was actually invited to come because they'd been looking for a bassoon player for quite some time. But they were very encouraging and said, look, just come and play for a few weeks and see how you like it, and we'll see how we like you. And then during that time, I did a kind of recital audition. So it wasn't a normal audition where I was up against a lot of other players. And in some ways, it was more comfortable. I could just play the pieces I wanted, and I played a few excerpts, and then they gave me a trial. I still did a trial in the orchestra for 6 months, and then I was appointed. For auditions these days, I luckily don't do anymore, but when I'm talking to students, it's interesting because I've been on a lot of panels, and I often find when students come to me to play through their repertoire for an audition that's coming up, the first thing I often have to say is play what's actually on the page. They often don't follow, what's actually there, and really trying to look for what the composer wants from that piece, or some of them haven't even listened to recordings of the whole piece. And for bassoon especially, a lot of our excerpts for auditions are extremely short. So you have to make an impression, for example, Beethoven 4, it's only a couple of bars. It's very fast and very scary, but you have to still make an impression in those 2 bars. With students, I try to explain to them that they have to play in a way that stands out above the rest, and that often involves even if they're nervous, they should play with confidence, and especially when they're playing their Mozart concerto, play as though they're extremely proud of their interpretation and they think it's the best in the world, and so that when people are listening, they'll sit up and take notice and think, oh, that sounds like somebody who's confident and knows what they're doing.
How do you advise students when they have this very, very short amount of time to make an impression? And I don't know whether you do this in Australia, but it happens a lot in Europe, where they're going to be playing behind a screen, so they don't have the eye contact or connection with the panel.
Well, yes, in Sydney we have the first round behind a screen, and then the screens are taken down for the other rounds. Because generally with bassoon you're asked to play the first part of the Mozart concerto, and I mean the first 8 bars are very important, because in those first 8 bars, because then you have a little break, that's where you have a chance to make an impression. And so often when people come, we go over those first 8 bars a lot, to sort of try and tell them, you need to play, as though you really know the piece, and with a big sound. I mean, it's also a little bit different if they're going for a principal job or for a second bassoon job. I think for principal, you need to really show a lot of your own personality, because you need to have leadership qualities, and so that also should come through in your playing, that you play with a real solo character. And when they get to the excerpts, if they get to some of the excerpts, it's also really, being incredibly exact, more so than even in orchestra, because they have to remember that they're playing to a panel. I mean, in Sydney, the panel consists of the whole wind section and some string players and concertmaster. But, there are only a few people who play the bassoon on that panel. So, and everyone has the music in front of them. So you have to really make sure you're doing what's there, but also, don't play in a boring way. You have to play with musicality. Intonation is often incredibly important in auditions, and sound. When I'm teaching bassoon, a lot of it's about making a beautiful sound on the instrument.
But what happens if those students can do all of that in the privacy of their practice room, or even in the teaching room with you, but they just fall apart when they're actually in the audition? And how do you help them with that?
I mean, that's also for myself, because we all get nervous, and it's always, for bassoon, there are often pieces which are a difficult soft entry. For example, Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, it starts with a bassoon very low, and that's the kind of excerpt you can play at home in your living room 10 times, and it's always perfect. And then in front of 2,000 people, suddenly something happens and the note doesn't speak. But over the years, I've sort of found what's really important is to know how your body works physically. So that and what I often teach is, when you're doing things, when you're playing, it's almost like you're analysing how your throat and your embouchure are working, and especially your breathing. Because that's something, when you're tense, you tend to tense up in the shoulders, and if you want to play a soft note, there's often a little hiatus just before you come in with tension, and then of course it won't speak. And that's no excuse, really. Even if I have to play something like that and I'm nervous, in the orchestra, I'm really sitting there thinking about, where are my shoulders, am I relaxed, am I breathing properly? And that way I almost know that the note's going to come out, because I know what's happening physically with my body. And a lot of students don't, it's a bit hit and miss. They play it and it works, and they think, oh, well, it's fine. And then when they're nervous, they're not sure why it doesn't work. So explaining that to them about their body, I think, helps quite a bit.
Do you find that a lot of your students kind of tend to beat themselves up, and, as you said before, are their own worst critic? I mean, do you find that you can sort of help them with that?
I think some of them could be a bit more critical, actually, about their own playing. And I think it's also teaching students how to listen properly, because often students come and they play something, they look at the teacher and they say, how was that? But I mean, they heard it as well. They should be able to judge just like a teacher does. And it is a different way of listening. It's kind of going outside yourself and listening objectively, with positive criticism. And I often ask them, well, what did you think? Did you think there was a good sound? And they say, well, no. Well, do it again. They need to judge that themselves, and that's very important when they're in an orchestra or practicing those excerpts, that they can play it on their own and realize that's the sound which is going to carry, that's the sound. And, on any instrument you get used to the idiosyncrasies of that instrument, and especially wind instruments, they have certain notes which are flat or sharp, but you need to basically listen carefully and make sure you make up for that and you play very well in tune.
So how do you personally deal with performance anxiety? Do you have any times when you're nervous?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, certain pieces, some pieces, I think luckily a lot of the bassoon solos are quite melodic and slow, and I like that. I can sort of get in my own zone and feel comfortable. And some of the ones where you're sitting there and suddenly you play something very fast and then it's over in a flash. They're the ones I kind of lie awake at night and think, I hope that's going to go well. And I think I used to over practice them. I'd be so intent on getting it so perfect, and I'd practice and practice, and then in the end, actually the more important thing I find these days is concentration. Not because you can practice it as much as you like, but if you sort of freak out in the moment, it's still going to go wrong. And I find now I sort of often before the performance, I might just go over the piece very slowly instead of at the speed it's at, but just go over it thinking about the fingerings. Often on bassoon, the fingerings are very complicated, so where the fingers are going, and but in a slow tempo, it's to sort of imprint it on my mind, and then I won't play it at all in the tempo it's supposed to be until it comes in the piece, and just with concentration. I find that helps more than over practicing.
Have you ever had any performing disasters, or what you might consider performing disasters, when you're actually in a performance?
Yes, I'm trying to think of some. It's more, I think it comes again back to concentration. And it's usually because suddenly I kind of freak out or black out at that moment and something goes wrong. And then afterwards you think, oh, what the hell was that about, And often our solos are so short, you sort of, it's gone past and you think, well, that was terrible. And I think that's often, and I find that also because I travel a lot, dealing with jet lag. I often, if I'm tired or not in the right zone, time-wise, I have to really, when I'm sitting on stage, I can already feel I'm not, I'm a bit spaced out or something, and I have to really tell myself, concentrate, and I actually physically sort of really look at the part and look at the music, because that helps me focus on what's going on.
How do you manage the logistics of all the travelling and the jet lag and the hotel rooms? And tell me a little bit more about that.
I mean, when I first came to Sydney, I told the orchestra I wanted to continue as much as possible doing COE, and I managed to do about 50 or 60% of the COE work, which is about 50, 60 days a year. But it means I do that horrendous trip 5 times a year, and I've been doing that for 15 years. I mean, over the year, I don't take any sort of medication when I get there or on the plane. I just try and sleep or rest. And then what I find helps me is when I arrive, I go straight to work. I often book my flight, so I arrive on the day of the first rehearsal, and somehow the adrenaline I still have left gets me through that day, but it also helps me adjust quickly to the other time zone. So I try to do that. I arrive, I go to rehearsal, I sort of struggle through, and then I even try and go out for a meal that evening so that I can go to bed at a fairly normal time. Because I've only got really 2 days, generally there are 2 days of rehearsal and then there's the first concert. So I really need to get used to that time zone quickly. And then on the day of the concert, I make sure I have at least an hour, even sometimes 2 hours sleep in the afternoon, just so that I can, not too close to the concert, otherwise it's hard to wake up again. But just so I can be focused in the concert. Usually it works fine. And I also don't think about what time it is in Australia or if I'm in Australia, what time it is in Europe. And And I kind of hate it when people say, "What time is it in Sydney?" I don't really want to know. I just think I'm here now, and this is the time here, and so it's sort of a mental thing. I try and get through the jet lag that way.
Do you have any particular views about beta blockers and in using those for nerves?
I think they are useful, and I know a lot of colleagues use them, and I've tried them as well. I find when I tried it, it also, because it lowers your adrenaline, but that can also mean, you kind of, everything drifts by a bit, and and you can easily, just sit there and not come in at your entry. So it does calm you down, but I have actually in the past suggested it for, as you said before, students who, have everything prepared for an audition, but then totally freak out. Because an audition is a one-off thing. So I've said to them, look, try a beta blocker. And I remember with one student it worked. She, because she said in auditions every time she plays, she, can't concentrate, but she could play beautifully. And she did try a beta blocker, and she said, she got through to the last round. And so they are a great help for people.
When you're with your orchestral colleagues, is there ever any conversation about performance anxiety or how different people deal with performance stress, or is it still very much taboo?
I wouldn't say it's taboo, but it's the sort of thing I find people talk about perhaps after the concert or away. It's not the sort of thing people want to bring up just before a concert because they're dealing with their own things, and we all know everyone gets nervous, and if someone says I feel nervous, they might actually make the other person feel nervous. So they tend to, if I'm feeling anxious about a concert, I generally keep to myself. I play a double reed instrument, so we usually get there quite early. Also the oboist, because the reeds we play on, they're even different from in the green room to the stage. So we get there early, and I kind of work on the reed, make sure it's working properly. And luckily in Sydney, we're allowed to go on the stage so we kind of, straggle on 10 minutes before the concert, and we can warm up on stage, which is great, because I often, in the green room, I don't know which reed I'm going to play until just before the concert. They change so much, so that's a stress we have, which some players perhaps don't have.
Are there any differences for you between doing recordings in the recording studio and actually live performances in terms of performance anxiety and stress?
These days, the orchestra, even Sydney and also Chamber Orchestra of Europe, we rarely do recordings which are only in the studio. And a lot of the recording companies now are very keen to do live recordings, which in a way I prefer. And in some ways, even though it's stressful, I find it helps my concentration, because if I know this concert is being recorded, I really sort of think, okay, I really need to concentrate and make sure, because you don't want to be the one. Generally, there are some retake sessions the next day, even for a live recording. But you don't want to be the one that they have to do it again for. So you really concentrate and make sure you get your part right. And studio recordings, I did a solo one with Cembalo a few years ago, and I found that stressful because the repertoire was quite difficult, and we had, 3 days to do it, and it was cold outside, so it was more other stresses more than the actual recording itself. The same thing with the recordings, it's being prepared, especially for a double replay, having everything there, because there's no time to stuff around with reeds anymore. You have to be, have everything there and working.
And what's it like when everything goes really well on stage?
Oh, it's a fantastic feeling. And that can be subjective, though, because I find sometimes, I'm feeling good about my playing, and around me it all seems to be going really well. And in Sydney we repeat the concert sometimes 4 times in the week. So, one concert you might think, oh, that was really the best concert and it's fantastic. And someone else might say, oh, well, I thought yesterday was much better. So it can be quite subjective. But it is a great feeling, and sometimes, it can come to a point in the piece where I can hardly play because of the emotion of that point. You get so carried away, and I'm almost sort of cracking up in tears because it's just so fantastic. And that also is an acoustic thing, I find. Unfortunately, Sydney, even though the Opera House looks beautiful, the acoustic, we're allowed to say now, the acoustic's not great. But some of the halls in Europe, especially with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe, we've often played in Concertgebouw or the hall in Lucerne, which is amazing. And there you just feel like you can do anything. You can play the softest pianissimo, everyone's going to hear you, and it really feels like chamber music. And that also makes the performance a wonderful experience.
Matthew Wilkie, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you.